allow record.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm recording. Yep, fine.
Good, fine. And Alan, I think we agreed that explanation of the papers that you've done, you know, both the content of them and the question of how best to engage and explain to people.
Yes, hopefully you might have had a chance to look at what I sent through. And thanks very much for joining me and making this connection, which I'm very grateful for. I suppose that really what it's all about is that for a very long time, I felt that human beings were suffering from a really rather fundamental misconception of reality, and that I saw that that misconception was contributing to a great deal of unnecessary suffering. And that in fact, you know, when you look at these sorts of subjects that are of great interest on the forum and elsewhere, a great many of the problems that are being raised and talked about, to my mind, actually arise from that misconception. And so with the basic idea that prevention is better than cure, I feel that it's important for us to try to look at our perceptions of reality, how our varying human perceptions of reality, and to look at how those perceptions could affect the kinds of problems that we encounter, problems of living that we encounter as human beings. I have a particular way of thinking about it, which I've developed as the idea, or not so much the idea, but the awareness of natural inclusion, as I call it, which at a very simple level, which you almost don't even have to think about, except as soon as you use words, you're thinking. And that is that we have this basic understanding or awareness of ourselves living in receptive and responsive relationship with others in our natural neighborhood. So currently I'm in receptive and responsive relationship with all of you. I'm listening to you, you're listening to me, and we're responding to one another. And that this is a generality of the way we live in the world, in a receptive and responsive way, not as if we are independent subjects and objects. So that's at a very simple way of understanding what I'm talking about. And then once we've got that basic awareness, we can start thinking more cognitively, actually thinking about why it is or how it must be that is how we live, and how it could be that we might have come to some sort of other idea, in particular how we could have arrived at what I call an objectivistic way of viewing ourselves and one another in the natural world, and an objectivistic view of nature. And that to me is an issue, and it's really now for me to ask you if you understand what I'm saying there, or whether you have any different ideas or perceptions that you'd wish to bring out.
Yeah. Shall I go first? I mean,
Yeah.
Hi, Alan. We've not met before, so firstly, nice to see you, nice to hear you, and thanks for the sort of the time here. This is kind of a relatively, let's say, sort of new area for me. Yes, I'm coming at this as kind of your probably ideal target in the sense of ignorance. So I'm going to probably ask questions which you may consider to be obvious or stupid, but I'm not afraid of doing that. So bear with me. It seems to be implicit then in kind of what you're saying, that you think we've shifted from, let's say, a world that may have existed in the past where we did listen, where we did spend time together face to face, or maybe obviously before these sorts of mechanisms were available, but we no longer do, or we do less so. Yeah, and that's, we've shifted to, you call this a sort of objective, yeah, sort of distanced, yeah, sort of manner of living, shall we say, yeah. And I just, yeah, I'm trying to get my mind around that in the sense of whether I think that's actually, yeah, the case from my own sort of perspective. Is that objectivism sort of in the sense of the rise of, let's say, sort of technology and sort of scientific thinking? Is that what's what's, in your view, assuming, yeah, that there is this shift, what has caused this shift, or what is behind this shift?
It's a very important question, and thank you for your response. And actually, it's quite important that I talk to people for whom this is new, or because I spend a lot of my time talking to people who've heard me speak very often and seen my writings very often. And so it is this question of, how does it come across to someone, almost as it comes almost out of the blue. Mm. The question as to how it arose goes very deep. I think that we certainly, in philosophical terms, can go back to ancient Greece and to the ideas of Plato and in particular Aristotle, and to the idea of the development of a system of logic based on opposition, on the notion of the excluded middle, that one thing cannot simultaneously be another thing. And that so we have to get it. And as soon as you start thinking that way, you become locked into a true or false kind of logic, a so-called two-value logic, which now has no possibility in between, and no possibility of understanding that there is a middle way between what appear to be two opposing sides. That's very obvious in our politics currently, that we're stuck in a system of politics that very much is either you're on the left or on your right, and the middle view, which actually is able to see both ways, is excluded from consideration or considered somehow to fall between two stools. So I think that we're certainly going back to ancient Greece and to atomism. The way that a system of logic developed, which in effect isolated or dissociated matter or material presence from immaterial presence. The idea, that all attention is focused on the material, and the immaterial is somehow regarded as somewhere else or not part of this world. So that has part of the origin. Even deeper down, we're getting to issues to do with deep and profound psychological fear, and fear in particular of the void, the fear of death, the fear of nothingness, and the development of a way of thinking that is defensive, and tends to at least give you a sense of being, a sense of security, of being yourself independently of what else is going on. And I sometimes quote Hamlet in terms of to be or not to be. That is the question, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. And essentially that is a statement of opposition towards the other and objectification of the other, and actually also of the self, which is implicit in the idea that either I am or I am not. So there's a sort of very, very deep-seated way of thinking, which is very, very prevalent. And of course, it goes all, it's embedded in in most of our mathematics. It's embedded in our objectivistic idea of how science should be done. Darwin talked about the scientific man ought to have no affections, no emotions, merely a heart of stone. This idea of being able to somehow stand outside of what you're observing, to actually observe as an outsider. to what you're observing, and in that sense be cut off from it. And that then gave rise to, the scientific revolution, so-called Enlightenment thinking, and essentially viewing the world only from the position of a third person or outsider. And that's embedded in the way that science has been especially communicated and in its methodology. So essentially we get into this third person only way of viewing reality, which cuts out the first and second person views, cuts out the personal.
Okay, no, that's very useful. I mean, just a quick follow-on before maybe I know other people. So, but is this? Obviously, you trace back the roots a long way. But is your sort of thesis that this is somehow getting worse? That there's a sort of widening sort of gap, shall we say? I mean, in recent decades or in recent, or has it kind of always been there and it's really no different fundamentally from?
It's very difficult because, of course, we're only living in our own time. So, whether it's actually always been there or whether it's getting worse, I sense that it's been getting worse. I sense that, recent happenings in politics suggest that it's getting worse. I sense that the emergence of selfish gene theory back in the 1970s is an indicator of it getting worse. I sense that Thatcherite, economics, those kinds, and the emergence of game theory, the notion of selfishness itself, and as if these are, things that we accept as as if they're truth, without questioning. Even the American Declaration of Independence has an element of that to it. It's that notion of the self being independent of neighborhood, independent of other, and it is deep rooted. But I do sense that it's been getting worse, and I suppose what upsets me is that I felt that there was a time, perhaps during the 1960s, when there was a very clear indication that it was being questioned, and that questioning, which occurred during the 1960s, it increasingly became abandoned, and we got a sort of coming back of very discriminatory ways of thinking and viewing one another and the world.
Yes, I come from a Buddhist background, and you're ringing lots of bells in a Buddhist sense for me. Has Buddhism been an influence, or do you see it as being an influence?
Buddhism, I didn't come to this understanding through Buddhism. I've certainly noticed that what I'm saying seems to have a great deal in common with Buddhism, and I have one or two Buddhist friends, in particular one who occasionally communicates me from Japan with me from Japan. And yes, I mean I do see a strong affinity with Buddhism, but I'm probably starting I'm starting from a very different place.
Right.
My starting point was really, I suppose, I'm a biologist, I'm a naturalist. I came across, obviously I would be exposed to Darwinian thinking and neo-Darwinian thinking, and in particular to the extraordinary surge in the so-called sociobiology, which is related to sort of individualistic selection theory, and that way of thinking disconcerted me. I was worried by it. I suppose that if there were two aspects of me in terms of values that I had embedded in me when I was very young, one was honesty and the other was compassion, and I actually found that the way that my fellow biologists were thinking about and explaining the evolutionary process first of all, it seemed dishonest at some quite deep level, but it certainly brings a conflict with ideas of compassion and living in a compassionate relationship with one another. And of course, that goes also to the heart of the Christian tradition, of essentially, loving your neighbor as yourself. And actually that means essentially establishing an empathic relationship with other. And so, yeah, I certainly do see affinities with Buddhism. There are aspects of Buddhism, and I always find it hard when I'm sort of on the spot now. Now, what is it about Buddhism that I might not agree with?
Yeah.
And I'm more interested in what I agree with than what I might not agree with. I think that what I perhaps the area of difficulty for me is that the notion of no self that develops within Buddhism. I'm also quite obviously unaware of Taoism and the sort of notions of yin yang and all those sorts of areas. But the notion of no self isn't quite how I see things.
Right.
The way I see the self differently from, and the self is not a definitive entity isolated from its neighborhood. But I see a self as naturally included in neighborhood, or self-identity is naturally included in neighborhood. Okay. So as a self, rather than something which is actually in a way expunged. So and that sort of might be an area of a certain amount of difficulty, but often those kinds of difficulties are down to language and the way we communicate.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for that.
Just thinking about the emergent feelings of self at the moment. I'm on holiday with my 2-year-old granddaughter. Well, she'll be 3 in a couple of months, and it's just so striking over the last couple of months or whatever, how on the one do things for herself. So as soon as you start doing something, she will say, Rosie will do that, Rosie will do that. And then if you say, are you a girl, are you a this, or are you a that, or whatever, and she says, no, I'm a Rosie. So she's testing out for herself, what is herself, and how is she, part of other collections and so on. And I just wondered if you'd reflected on or studied how people's sense of identity emerges, and whether that's different in different cultures, perhaps.
Yes, I've certainly looked at it, and I think one of the things to look at quite closely is really to draw on one's own experience and my own memories of being young, of being a child, and my own emerging sense of self-identity. And I suppose this may also have quite a lot of relevance with how I ultimately found myself expressing myself as an adult. I was born in Africa, and I was born in Nairobi, Kenya, during the 1950s, or in 1950. I lived there in the early stages of my life during the Mau Mau Rebellion. My mother was a politician. She became deputy mayor of Nairobi. She was about to be mayor when we were rushed back home. But one of the things that she did, she was a very remarkable person, my mother, in a lot of ways. But one of the things she did was her attitude to the emergence of conflict was to bring together all the participants around a table to talk with one another. Or in fact, so she invited into her living room, into our living room at home, all these different characters, and Kenya was a very multiracial place. So you had Africans, you had Asians, you had people of European affinity, and all to do with the running of the council. And they would sort of be gathered around in this circle in our living room, and I would sit next to him. And I had this extraordinary sort of feeling one day as I was looking at all these people gathered around, and I was there. I had this extraordinary sense of all these people are just as much in my world as I am in their world, and I had this, and I think we all have this almost TARDIS sense of self, is that, you know, if we think about ourselves and our own consciousness internally, it's as though we're hugely larger on the inside than we appear on the outside. Mm-hmm. And I found that, you know, I sort of that sort of thought that, you know, here I am, I feel huge inwardly, and yet, you know, I'm looking at these other people who seem quite small at a distance, but each of those other people will also be feeling huge inwardly. And I suppose that from then on, I had a very strong sense of living in one another's neighborhood, and our self-identities relating to one another in that way, and thinking about, there's almost this, it's a strange thing to sort of, I'm looking at you behind your glasses at the moment, and, you know, and there is these two feelings about that, is that I'm seeing an image of you which is actually quite an objective image, a distanced image, and yet at the same time I'm aware that all the sorts of things that I'm aware of internally within myself are going on in you too, as you look out upon the world. So it's sort of this business of being able to look both ways, and that sort of, you develop a sense of your own identity as a unique human being, but you equally get that sense of all other people as unique human beings and unique identities. But you also have the sense that we have an enormous amount in common, and it's and in particular, we're inhabiting the same space essentially, which takes us back to those very basic issues to do with the nature of reality and how we perceive reality. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Yeah, it's very good. You got me thinking about a few other things there, in a sense of, it's only if we probably spend time with people, and listen, and obviously are interested to know, who they are and what makes them what they are, that maybe we can fully appreciate, the sort of those other people. And I'm just kind of thinking whether that's a part of the issue, in the sense of, if this is a bigger issue now than it was 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, is somehow or other maybe we're not spending time together as much. I mean, does that, is that relate to breakdown of family structures? Is that a pace of living which allows less time? Is it these sorts of technologies we're using today that creates distance at one level? It brings us together in one way, but I don't know. I'm just kind of trying to think about, is there a shift there, that has somehow accelerated its objectivity? Or
yeah, I think there is a shift, and I think one has to also look at the way we've been educated, or we've been educating one another, especially in recent times. Is that as I look back through my education, and especially my biological education, because I became a biologist, the way that got coloured by Darwinian thought, and how Darwinian thought arose from Newtonian thought, and we got to this point of teaching science as if the observer was separated from the observed, and that was a self-evident truth, that somehow we've been reinforcing this idea of the self as isolated, not just different from other or distinct from other, but as actually isolated from other. I remember too, I suppose again, the influence of my parents is, I remember that, you know, sort of, that they used to, my mother was very environmentally interested, one of the first environmentalists in a way, and she used to sort of get very upset at noticing people opening their car windows and throwing things out, you know, littering up the countryside. And I suppose she impressed on me the idea that this was a symptom of feeling that the outside had nothing to do with you, that it was just the outside world that you dumped stuff into, and that you know, it had nothing to do with your world. And she was pointing out that, you know, I mean, that there's a tremendous fallacy in that, because we're utterly dependent on what we're living within, and the outside world is not cut off from us. But I think that the idea somehow has been embedded, enforced more and more. You know, I suppose during my university career, I became more and more upset about it, actually, as I saw the way that universities were changing in this country at the very least, and perhaps everywhere else as well, with the increased commercial interest, the loss of focus on trying to enhance human understanding, and much more of, you know, commercially fitting in, with, you know, training students up to do a particular job in society, rather than helping them to think, or to really question what they were being taught. And I did then, you know, that did lead me to develop, after a period of breakdown, it led me to develop a course at University of Bath, which I think was still almost exceptional. I called it Life, Environment and People. And I included in that course biologists, psychologists, natural scientists, management students. They all came along. Many of my colleagues in the early days tried to stop me. I mean, literally tried to stop me doing it, because I was asking the students they felt that I was asking students to question their authority, which in a way I was. Because I was just, you know, I was asking the students to just, you know, always ask this important question: is what you're being told, does it make sense? What is the evidence for it? Does it make sense? Which is actually a very scientific way of going about things. We ask, well, what's the evidence, and does this make consistent sense? And if it doesn't, then what would? And so that anyway, I've rambled on quite a lot there. I'll push back over to you.
Okay, one thing I wonder, a couple of years ago, I came across paraconsistency. I don't know if you know of it, do you? It's a system of logic that allows for something to be something and not be it as well. I'll put a link, as you're not familiar with it, I'll just put a link in the chat. Maybe you can have a look at it at some point. It's very, I found it very exciting that it could replace Aristotelian logic with something a bit more less explosive, it's called. So anyway, the link is in chat. So I'd be interested, maybe on the forum, after you've had a look at it, you could give a bit of a think about it for me.
Yes. Thanks very much. I'll look at it a bit later, because
yes.
I mean, the sort of thing it struck me as having a relationship to almost immediately was dialectics.
It does, yes. It does.
In the sense of, you know, the notion that two apparently opposing truths can both be true simultaneously. Yes. And actually, where I went to, I actually feel that, you know, natural inclusional logic goes beyond dialectics.
Right.
In that, it allows things to be distinct, but not definitively. A lot of our difficulty arises from logic which tries to be definitive. It says either or it says it's either this way or that way, or alternatively it's both ways but in mutual contradiction.
Yes.
So the first way is propositional logic, the second way is dialectic logic, and the dialectic is about thesis and antithesis and trying to find a synthesis. Well, if you like, natural inclusion goes beyond both of those, because it recognizes that nature is not in any way definitive, that we cannot isolate anybody from its surroundings or from another, and that we can actually get to the point of recognizing how these apparently opposing truths can actually simultaneously be true, quite simply actually through the movement from essentially a definitive or frozen logic of into a dynamic logic, into a flow logic.
Okay.
So that we're understanding that natural form always arises through a combination of stillness and movement, and that the form comes into being. I sometimes do it that way. If you imagine playing with a sparkler on a dark night, and you're whirling the sparkler around, you will actually create a circular form.
Yes.
Yep. And it'll appear like a circular form, but the way that it's actually made requires a dynamic process of movement around a central point of stillness. And that essentially is how I think form arises fundamentally, is that we're looking at all natural material forms, all natural bodily forms arise through this, if you like, circulation of informative energy around a receptive point, of zero. And that then takes us into quite a contradiction of conventional mathematics, because in the sense what we have now is an awareness that what we call the number one is actually a dynamic inclusion of zero. Okay, instead of having a logic that divides zero from one, or puts a binary logic of one or zero, we actually have zero inside one, and one as a circulatory, as a dynamic identity within infinity, within infinite space everywhere. So we move to actually quite a different kind of logic, and a different mathematical logic. Even though the calculation side is the same, the understanding of the maths is very, very different, because we have this different notion of what the number one is, as an inclusion, as a dynamic inclusion of zero in infinity. And that sounds terribly grand, but it's not really. It's just thinking about one of the ways I like to think about it is think about the way we used to form circles at schools. Geometrically, we would put a hole. We would have a compass, and the compass would have a needle point, and it would have a pencil. And you'd put the needle into the paper, it created a hole, and then you circulated the pencil point around that. And that actually then creates the circle. And I sort of see that as the relationship between the moving point, if you like, and the stationary point. Co-creating. So it's a kind of dance.
A dance, yes. Nice.
It is a dance, yes. A dance of the receptive with the responsive, yes.
But quantum mechanics and quantum physics and quantum computing, and the idea of a qubit can be a 0 and a 1 at the same time, seems to be very relevant to this, in the sense that our mathematics, our understanding of our universe has evolved, and there are these kind of I'm not saying we understand it, but we have come up with models that would seem to explain it, proven or otherwise. Isn't that really very parallel to what you're kind of saying, that we now can kind of start to get our minds around that if something can be both 0 and a 1 at the same time, depending how we look at it, or how we somehow
Well, okay, yes. Well, quantum mechanics is very relevant. I don't go straight to quantum mechanics because I don't really understand quantum mechanics myself, and I prefer to sort of start from this place, which I feel is actually quite self-evident from our personal experience. You know, of an awareness that you can't actually isolate matter from space.
Mm.
So, and I think that we can reach that without going to quantum mechanics. We can work that out very, very simply. The difficulty with quantum mechanics and with all, to my mind, modern physics and modern math is that it is still relying on the same objectivistic or mathematical logic, the same 1 or 0 logic, yeah, or the same dissociation of the material from the immaterial that was introduced long ago, you know, by the ancient Greeks and elsewise. And so the reason most people have a great deal of difficulty with quantum mechanics is that you're trying to understand what is essentially a relationship, yeah, using an outsider view. And that generates lots of peculiarities and paradoxes. I could, you know, it would probably take a long time to try to explain all that at this stage, and I'm not sure that I would be able to. But I've certainly I've always wished that someone with sorry. Yeah, I've always wished that someone with a much better understanding of quantum mechanics than me would actually try to talk about quantum mechanics in this relatively simple way of looking at the relationship, yeah, between a receptive presence of space and an informative presence of energy, and how that co-creates matter. And I do know 1 or 2 people who are going in that direction.
Okay.
And I think it'd be really wonderful if we could then sort of, because obviously, you know, when we're dealing with quantum mechanics, we're looking at, you know, what actually underlies the larger scale material existence that we're familiar with. And it's when we dive down into that world that there seems to be this inconsistency between our objectivistic worldview and the findings of quantum mechanics. And to me, yes, the findings of quantum mechanics, the findings, not the interpretation, the findings are telling us that, you know, actually underneath the way things might appear superficially is a very different reality from that which we think about as objective.
I'm going to have to break off for a moment, but carry on amongst yourselves. I'm kind of doing a little bit of helping with my granddaughter here at the same time, but I'll pop back in a moment. Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
You mentioned, I think there's once a word empathy a while back, and I think my observation, certainly not scientific, is that there has been, let's say, a rise in interest in empathy. In fact, now maybe it's kind of one of those classic things. It's probably peaked a little bit, and people are starting to question whether actually, you know, empathy is a universally good thing, which always says something in terms of, you know, that sort of that tipping point kind of whatever. There's also like been a fairly big rise in what I would call the happiness movement. In the sense of, groups, get-togethers, focusing on, trying to understand what happiness is or what it means or be happy. So I just wonder how those those reactions, shall we say, relate to what you're saying, and are they a symptom? Are they kind of a result, do you think, of what you're
yes, sorry. Yeah, I think they are a symptom of people yearning for something different, yearning for something which is much more to do with their feelings than there's a reaction against materialism per se. well, of course, what you mean by materialism is an interesting question. You don't end up denying that there's such a thing as material. But what you may do, in my mind, is develop a better understanding of the nature of material as not something which is isolated from the immaterial. Yes, I see the sort of positive psychology movement. I see the sort of interest in empathy, issues to do with creativity, the sort of NLP programming, interested in being in the moment, and all these kinds of ideas are symptoms of an effort to break free of what to many people does feel like a very constraining way of viewing the world, and an alienating way of viewing the world. I think it can also go down a slightly difficult path, in that I never use the words positive and negative to mean positive equals good and negative equals bad. I actually, within my own understanding, see positive as being about generosity, about giving, and negative as being about receptivity, about receiving. And I see those two in a relationship with one another, just as I described the dance, if you like, of the dynamic, yeah, around the still point. I think it can, there is quite a danger in some of these areas of psychology in negating the negative, in regarding human vulnerability, human anger, those kinds of emotions as something, as a flaw, as something to be denigrated or set aside. There's been a huge element of dissing the ego, sort of saying our big problem is ego. It's to my mind, it's not ego, it's egotism that's the problem, or egoism. And egoism is actually about that very extreme form of, well, almost narcissistic self-assertion, where you regard the self as set aside from its neighborhood, and hence exerting power over it. And of course, you may think that there are some rather obvious examples of that going on politically currently. Where someone thinks that I'm right and everyone else is wrong, and my truth is true and everyone else's truth is fake, and all those kinds of strange ideas. But I feel that actually in other words, there is a movement, there is a feeling that we need to get out of a habitual way of thinking. But I don't know that necessarily the comprehensive way of doing it has become clear. And of course, I go so far as to think that natural inclusion does provide such a way clear, because that's how it seems to me. I certainly have my own issues, with that. I have huge anxiety problems and such sorts of things. So I'm, a very, very ordinary kind of person in a lot of ways. And I have all my own vulnerabilities. But I think that's actually part of the story, is that we actually have to appreciate our own vulnerabilities and fallibilities and where those arise from, rather than denigrate them.
Couldn't agree more with that point. So in some ways, what you see this as almost like the underpinning theory, yeah, that those movements, shall we call them, the happiness or the this is the thing that gives them some logic, some
Yes, I do think it. I go so far as not really to think of it as a theory, which is why I go as far as sort of trying to describe it as an awareness, because actually theory, to my mind, has got so associated with putting distancing the observer from the observed, and creating models based on such distancing. That's what I see as theory, and I don't really see natural inclusion as theory so much as an awareness of what in some ways seems very obvious. That's what I find quite difficult. Is at some level, all I'm saying, is that is that form is somewhere and space is everywhere, and you can work it all out from there, because that means that any kind of logic that says form and space are mutually exclusive or one and the same isn't going to make sense. My hand is somewhere, space is everywhere. Take my hand away, and space is still there. And that understanding of space is really about understanding the intangible. Space as an intangible presence, not as a mathematical presence. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
This excuse me if this, yeah. I mean, excuse me if this is a digression, but the talk of and the conversation may have moved on, but the talk of quantum and Newtonian theories reminded me of a discussion I had with a community activist and former civil servant, Eileen Conn, who I quoted on the Fellows Forum the other day. The issue was Judy Rees, her post about how can the forum members and the fellowship, which is a fairly self-organizing setup, engage with the hierarchy of the RSA. And Eileen, and I'll just share my screen on this. Irene likens communities to kind of quantum theory, and organizations to Newtonian, and community organizers organizing people in their neighborhoods, if you like, working in with each other, and organizations will tend to be hierarchical. So different perspectives, different ways of experiencing, different ways of seeing things, and working between the two, quite difficult. Anyway, just another play off the analogy.
Yeah, but that's very interesting, because if you look at any large organization, my career is working with large companies that historically are command and control, but have evolved some more so than others, particularly, let's say, newer organizations, the Googles of the world. So they tend to be flatter, in a sense of numbers of hierarchies. And the big challenge for most organizations is to try to encourage that networking across physical sites and across silos that are functional. Marketeers versus accountants that are obviously quite different in mindset and education and so on, and much prefer to do what they do with as minimum interference from the people next door. And that the big challenge for CEOs and senior people is they have to get those people to work together much more effectively, and to communicate and to share across traditional boundaries, and come up with a common language, for example, and spend time together. So it's quite interesting in the sense of those traditionally, those models are trying to become more networked, i.e. more like the bottom half of that beef burger or whatever, bun or whatever, and probably don't do it very well. I mean, I don't think there's many kind of, examples of that really, being done very, very well, but, it does happen to varying degrees. So I'm just wondering whether that means is there a coming together? I mean, is there some, or potentially some sort of hybrid middle, or I don't know.
Well, I think that this is again where what I'm trying to bring forward is really quite important, because we're talking of getting caught between two views of reality. There's which literally is an abstract view of reality, which is all about objects separated from one another by space, and having definitive boundaries. And we're talking, and that reality is very much one which supports hierarchical structure and hierarchical organization, and is indeed all about essentially it's actually divide or unite and overrule. Is that sort of the original sort of atomistic or objectivistic logic says that is either things are definitively separate, or they're one and the same. And when you get to an understanding that no, the middle way between those the two truths is actually what makes realistic sense, that natural forms are distinct, are dynamically distinct, but never isolated from one another, and that we move into a way of thinking in terms of flow rather than a way of thinking in terms of a frozen geometry, then we actually get past all that, and we start to think in terms of organizations and communities and individuals and so on, that actually see these as not in any way being in contradiction with one another. That the notion of the individual and the group being in some sort of conflict is not true, because the individual is included in the group, and the group depends on individual difference, and so on. These are all areas that I've actually thought an enormous lot about and written a lot about.
Can I just check in on timing? That something I have to go and do, but I'm very happy that you just continue with the connection, and I'll come and tidy it up a bit later if that's fine. But I'm conscious we're not quite yet at an hour. But are you happy to carry on for a bit, or?
I'm happy to carry on as long as anyone wants to. I've got a free time this afternoon.
Let me leave you to find a natural ending when you're happy to do that, if that's okay. And I'll leave recording. Yeah. And just say a thank you to Alan and Philip and Brendan. I think this really proves how useful a conversation is compared with only having the written word. But sorry to break off.
Okay, well, thank you very much for organising it.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Is there any, in dealing with people, no, that sounds wrong too. In the relationship with people, there is a sense of myself and other, which is separate from me. And if but you would say that there is no difference, there is no separation between me and other. So
I would.
Yeah, go on, please. I'm sorry, I'm not so clear.
Yeah, I mean, I say that you're distinct. We're distinct from one another. We have different distinctive identities, but we're not isolated from one another. The very fact that we're currently in communication tells us that we're not isolated from one another. Right. We live in each other's influence and in each other's neighborhood. So I'm not going to that sort of way of thinking that says we're all one. But I am thinking of ourselves as local identities within a continuum. Okay, so that, and this is where, the role of space, natural space, not Cartesian space, not space, mathematical space, but natural space, or in the Buddhist terms, no-thingness, becomes extremely important, because classic logic has tended to regard space as an absence of presence, if you like, whereas I regard space as a presence of absence.
Yes.
And that's actually really important, because when we understand space as a presence of absence, we recognize it has certain very, very important qualities. And amongst those qualities are frictionlessness and hence receptivity. Okay, so space, the presence of space, is what makes the existence of matter possible. In the first, and in fact, we can ultimately arrive an understanding of matter as 100% space plus circulating energy. So, it is without space, matter can't exist.
Yes. I lived in Japan for a while, and one distinction that I made, or that was made, was that Westerners see trees and Easterners see the forest. I think that was it anyway. But there was, in a Japanese house, you have a tokonoma, which is possibly a scroll and a vase, and the rest of the room is completely empty. And I was struck how a Westerner would see the room as empty, but to a Japanese person, it's not empty. Emptiness is something real to them. It's not an absence of something, it's something in its own right.
Exactly right, and that's essentially a very large part of what I understand in natural inclusion, is that is emptiness is a presence, and it's an inviting presence, receptive presence, and and plays an extraordinarily important role in the co-creation of reality, as I understand it. So if we have a way of thinking, as we have done in the West, of putting all the emphasis on the tangible and completely forgetting the intangible, or as regarding the intangible as somehow outside of reality, that generates all sorts of paradoxes and all sorts of problems. So, yes, it's an interesting thing, is that the West tends to sort of see the tree, and the East sees the forest. And of course, the point is that you need to see both. You can't have a forest without trees and all the rest of it. Yeah. But also, it's really about yes, that it is the spatial presence that provides the continuity. And actually, if it's absent, it's an absence of friction. So it actually, it resists, it's non-resistant. And in that sense, is a superconductor, if you like. But bringing that awareness of space as a presence, as having the quality of receptivity, and of actually being vital for the even existence of matter, that'd be very important. Very, very simply, one of the ways I often talk about this or try to explain it is try to imagine, say, a tennis ball. Okay, we'll imagine a tennis ball. Imagine where it would be devoid of space if there was no space within it. If you actually abstracted all the space from the tennis ball, what would you have? And you'd have a 0 point. I'll fill in the answer. Yep, you'd be basically, because you'd end up with a dimensionless point. Try to imagine trying to imagine space without form, devoid of form, and we have formlessness. So yes. we arrive at this almost to me it's inescapable conclusion that form and space include each other. Yes, that space is included in form and form is included in space. The only way that circumstance can really be understood is if space is an intangible presence of stillness. Form is created through movement. Yep. Yeah. The combination of the movement and the stillness co-creates form, and what it means is that matter can't exist in 0 time. That takes us very deep indeed. But right at the heart of abstract logic and abstract mathematics is the notion of a mathematical point, a mathematical point mass that can exist in 0 time. And that starts to get into deep paradox. You can't have a material body that has no volume.
Of course, Zen loves paradoxes. It's all about paradoxes and understanding the paradox.
Yeah, I mean, I see it slightly differently. Is that seeing the paradoxes tells you how you're thinking. You know, to me, seeing a paradox is what it does in a Zen koan sense. Is it's telling you that actually it's only a paradox because of the way you're looking at the situation. And you know, so the search for paradoxes is not so much an effort to say that reality is paradoxical, as to say, if you see paradox, then there's something paradoxical about the way you perceive reality.
Okay.
I don't actually see, you know, that I suppose is again a big motivation for me, is that, you know, whenever I come across paradox or inconsistency, that makes me think, now how can we avoid that paradox, or how can, you know, what is the reality behind that apparent paradox? And again, that would take us to what I call the reality of natural inclusion, that space and you know, space and form are mutually inclusive.
Alan, I've got to drop out, but I'm just wondering, that's just, it really does kind of bring it alive, shall we say, beyond, and I think that's the value of these sorts of discussions. And I guess, Philip, you know, we're recording this, and I guess, Alan, you've got no problem with us sharing this? Maybe
Not at all, no, I'd be delighted.
I think that could generate follow-on kind of conversations, maybe with more people, or coming at this from different angles, and it's very relevant to the forum stuff as well, Philip.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining me.
No, thank you. And what do you particularly have? Where would you point me, other than rereading what's on the forum, to actually kind of to take this to the next stage, shall we say?
I mean, I have published a book very recently.
Okay.
Which is called The Origin of Life Patterns.
Yeah.
In the Natural Inclusion of Space in Flux. Most people don't understand that title, but you will now.
That's a start.
I mean, that book actually, I mean, to be honest, it's quite expensive. So if people have, you know, really want, you know, find the difficulty with that, then I do have a personal copy that I can share electronically.
Well, no.
So that's something that I'm happy to do, because it's more important that
the word gets out.
Yeah, than it's, yeah. There is a website that, you know, is on natural inclusion, you know, www.naturalinclusion.org. I've written far too many articles at a website called Best Thinking, but you can find lots there. I mean, I'm always very, very happy to communicate by email with anyone. So if you want to check up a point with me, you know, don't hesitate to send me an email.
Okay.
And my email is yeah, if you've got something calling you, my email is alan@admrayner.plus.com. So alan@admrayner.plus.com.
Okay.
And, you know, very, very happy to share anything with you, or to follow up on any specific points.
Okay.
But certainly the book, you know, it's short. It's 110 pages. It's got full of poems and paintings and photographs. Lots of visual stuff. I like to think it's intelligible.
I'm sure you're right. Well, you certainly are. You come across very, very well, I have to admit, in this forum as well.
Thank you very much.
No, I mean, to be honest, it's hard to know what to expect. But I mean, you really come across, I think, very, very well in this forum. So we should try and give you that platform for maybe some others. Huh?
Yeah, that would be lovely. Yes.
Okay. I'm gonna have a good weekend, guys.
Okay. Yep.
Nice meeting you, and I'm sure we will again.
Yeah. Okay. Cheers for now.
Cheers, Philip.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Are we there? You're muted at the moment, Philip.
Sorry, I was just saying thank you very much. It's been nice meeting you.
Yes.
And do have a look at paraconsistency, because it blew my mind when I came across it, and I enjoy it.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think it may be pointing in the right direction.
Yeah, it seems to be.
Yeah.
It seems to be.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll meet again on the forum, and I'm sure at other Zoom events. And
Okay.
I'll record this, and I'll put it on the RSA Fellows blog.
That would be lovely.
On the forum. Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thanks very much. Nice.
Thanks very much, and all the best. I guess David will disappear sooner or later.
Yes, he will.
Okay.
I'll leave meeting.
Okay. Thanks a lot.